The government now admits they are almost broke, and the debt ceiling isn't where the story ends, it's where it just begins. I'm going to explain this to you in one simple, fast step. Let's start by going over the QT doom loop. And actually, before we go there, editor, go ahead and throw up this bombshell report from the Congressional Budget Office that actually says the government could run out of money by this July. Absolutely unbelievable. But let's get right back to the chart. We start in 2000, goes all the way to today's date. On the left, we go from 0 trillion up to 5 trillion. The amount of bank reserves that are in the system on the Fed's balance sheet, assets of the commercial banking system. I want to point out that prior to the GFC, about 40 billion with a B. But when we get to, call it 2021, it reaches a peak of $4 trillion. $4 trillion with a T. And recently it has come down, but it's still hovering right around $3 trillion. And you may be saying to yourself, okay, George, well, why is that important? Let me explain. Let's look at what the Fed did prior to the GFC. So let's say that they had the overnight rate about 4% with $40 billion worth of reserves in the system. The Fed would not pay interest on those reserves, and there was a very, very small amount relative to M2 money supply. In fact, editor, go ahead and throw up a chart. We can see that M2 money supply was about 7.5 trillion with only 40 billion of bank reserves. And by the way, this number includes vault cash. So what does that mean? Well, this creates an environment where the banksters themselves have to compete for your deposits because you're lending your basically bank reserves to them, and that's what they need, and you're doing it at a cheaper rate than they can get from the other banks as set by the interest rate from the Federal Reserve. So in this scenario, let's say the Federal Reserve prior to the GFC sets the overnight rate at 5%. The banks are willing to pay you on a deposit account, let's say 4.8%. So the average Joe has a decision to make. He can either leave his money in the bank and collect 4.8%, or he can go ahead and let's say buy a T-bill at 5.5%. Now these aren't exact numbers. I'm just using them to illustrate the concept. But go ahead and fast forward to post GFC, where we've got $4 trillion worth of bank reserves in the system. This creates an environment where the banksters don't need your money. They don't need your deposits. They're absolutely flushed with reserves. And since they don't need your deposits, they won't compete for them by giving you a higher rate of interest. So what we have today is the Fed, let's say, taking rates to 5%, but the banks are only willing to pay you 0.5%, a measly 50 basis points. Notice how the delta has increased massively from where it was before the GFC. So now the average Joe has a choice. Will either keep my money in the bank at 0.5% interest, or go ahead and buy a T-bill or put it into a money market fund at 5%. Again, these are rough numbers. So obviously, it's a no-brainer. The average Joe is going to go out there and buy T-bills. And that takes us straight into the QT doom loop. Look at that, the magic of editing. Okay, so right now the average Joe is pretty much the only buyer of treasuries. Editor, go ahead and throw up that chart where we can see that pretty much all entities that would be involved with owning treasuries are reducing the amount of treasuries they have on their balance sheet, except for the U.S. retail investor, i.e. the average Joe. And why are they doing this? It goes right back to what we were saying before, because there's such an extreme rate differential between what the banks are paying them and what they can get on something like a treasury, a T-bill. Okay, well, let's think this through. Right now, the Fed is in the process of doing quantitative tightening. You guys know from watching my videos, that's simply when the Fed is allowing these treasuries to roll off their balance sheet. Okay, well, if the Fed isn't buying more treasuries, who is? Well, that would mean that Janet Yellen at the Treasury, when she's issuing more and more treasuries, those treasuries have to be absorbed by the private sector, or in other words, entities that are not the Federal Reserve. Okay, so we've got that, but also we need to understand that when the Fed is doing this, we'll get to that doom loop in a second, they're actually reducing the size of their balance sheet. So they're reducing the amount of bank reserves in the system. So at some point, those reserves will get down to a level, and it's not 40 billion, it's much higher than that, where the banksters have to compete for those deposits, just like they did in our previous example prior to the GFC. When that happens, the average Joe goes from being a buyer of treasuries and takes those currency units, goes right back into his savings account, which he's much more comfortable with because it's far more liquid, among other reasons. And that means there's no buyer for treasuries. So interest rates spike. And that's the premise of the QT doom loop. So let's go through this. Like we said right now, the average Joe taking his savings, turning it into treasuries, and then the Federal Reserve is reducing the size of their balance sheet. They're reducing the amount of bank reserves in the system. And at the same time, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, i.e. the government, is issuing more and more of these treasuries that have to be absorbed by an entity other than the Federal Reserve. So what that means is a lot more supply has to be absorbed by the market. And right now, the only bidder in the market is the average Joe. So let's assume the Federal Reserve continues quantitative tightening to the point where the banks have to start competing for those reserves. Well, that means interest rates will spike because Joe goes from treasuries back into savings, and then there's no buyer at the long end of the treasury curve. So let's say the 10-year treasury goes from 3.5%, where it is today roughly, up to 7%, just as an example. Well, ask yourself, what would happen to mortgage rates? What would happen to the housing market? What would happen to the stock market? As you guys know, they would most likely implode. So, editor, go ahead and throw up the next chart. We can see that there's a direct correlation between the tax revenue received by the government and asset prices. So if asset prices tank, that means there's less revenue going to the government. And then this creates an environment that poor Janet Yellen right here is holding a sign saying, I need money, because now there is so little tax revenue going into her coffers at the Treasury, i.e. the TGA. So the deficits explode. Well, this takes us right back to basically where we were at the beginning, where your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam has to issue more and more and more of these treasuries into a market where there might not be a buyer. Interest rates go up even higher, asset prices go down even further, tax receipts go down. Janet Yellen's deficit problem becomes even more extreme, and the cycle just continues to repeat itself over and over again, taking us right into the fiscal and economic abyss. This is the QT doom loop. So the main takeaway is the government is now admitting that they might be completely broke by July of this year. And the debt ceiling, or increasing that debt ceiling, by no means fixes the problem, because this is what we really should be worried about. The debt ceiling, at the end of the day, is child's play. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here. I will see you on the next video.